Welcome to Harbourside Kids at Home. We're in our second week of our wisdom series as we're looking through what wisdom means and how we get wisdom this month in August. Thanks for hanging out. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you're here for our next story. But I wonder if you remember what last week was on about. If you remember, we were looking at Jesus. And we're looking at a story when Jesus was really little. Maybe he was your age. He was just 12 years old. Now, in that story, Jesus got lost. Well, he wasn't really lost. He was missing. And his parents couldn't find him. If you remember, they went to Jerusalem, and then they were leaving, and as they were traveling, they were like, hang on a minute, Jesus isn't with us. And when they went to find him back in Jerusalem, they found him at the temple. And there was a really important thing that we learnt in that story, that wisdom is really important. Jesus thought wisdom was important, and he thought it was worth searching for. And so that was our bottom line from last week. So I'm going to write that up on the board. Wisdom is worth searching for. And so Jesus, he said, well, wisdom is something I can get from being with my Father, being with God, and being with people who know him well. And so he hung out in the temple, and he was listening to the teachers and listening to people share about God's word, because he said that wisdom was worth searching for. And that was our bottom line from last week. Now this week, we're learning that we can trust God to give us wisdom. So if this was week 1, that was our first week, wisdom is worth searching for. This week, we can trust God. Sorry for my terrible writing. Trust God to give us wisdom. That's our second bottom line, right? Our bottom line is the big idea we want to get to at the end of our story. So week 1 was wisdom is worth searching for. We want to look for it. We want to seek it out like Jesus did. And this week, we can trust God to give us wisdom. Now we're going to hear about this interesting, a pretty crazy story in the Bible. Now, I don't know if you know of a character called King David. You might know of him from a story called David and Goliath. That's a really big, well-known story that we know in the Bible, where David kills and fights Goliath and defeats him with a few stones. Well, David, he becomes king over God's people, the Israelites. And while he's king, he does lots of awesome and really good things. And he writes a lot of things down. He writes a lot of songs and poems, and we have those in the book of Psalms in our Bible. But King David also eventually had a son. And as David got older and eventually he passed away, his son, King Solomon, took over the reign. He was now the king of Israel. Well, Solomon was young, and he was experienced. He might have been young like me. He might have been even younger than me, maybe your age. Well, Solomon was young. He was inexperienced, and he didn't know how to lead his people well. But King David, his father, had taught him to listen to God's word. He taught him that God's word was important, that reading and listening to and learning from God's word was going to help him follow God well and help him be a good ruler. So, Solomon showed his love for God by obeying God's laws. Now, Solomon wanted to thank God for all he had done for him. So he went to the city of Gibeon and he offered up 1,000 sacrifices to honor God. That's pretty crazy. 1,000 sacrifices. Lots of different things going. 1,000 sacrifices to honor God. That's insane. But it shows just how much Solomon valued and loved God and said God should have the honor and God should have the glory. Well, one night, while Solomon was asleep in Gibeon, God appeared to him in a dream. And God said, ask for anything you want me to give you. Well, that's a pretty crazy thing to be asked by God, isn't it? Ask for anything you want and I'll give it to you. I can think of a few things I might ask God and would love him to give me. But, I don't know. Solomon could have asked for being wealthy He could have asked for fame. He could have asked to be powerful and strong and mighty. But actually, we'll see that Solomon doesn't ask for any of those things. Solomon says this, "Lord my God, you have now made me king. You have put me in the place of my father David. But I'm only a little child. I don't know how to carry out my duties. I'm here among the people you have chosen," right? The Israelites, God's people. "They are a great nation. They are more than anyone can count. They're a huge nation at this point. So give me a heart that understands. Then I can rule over the people. I can tell the difference between what is right and what is wrong." And that comes from 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 7 to 9. And here's how God answers him. "You have not asked to live for a long time. You have not asked to be wealthy. You have not even asked to have your enemies killed," which would be probably a pretty important thing to ask for if you're a king over a nation. "Instead," God says, "you have asked for wisdom. You want to do what is right and fair when you judge people. Because that is what you have asked for, I will give it to you. I will give you a wise and understanding heart." That's really special, isn't it? See, God recognized that Solomon didn't seek after the really big things of the world. He didn't want riches, he didn't want fame, he didn't want to be powerful, or maybe today, he didn't want a big house or a flashy car or to be really, really, really important. Solomon said, well, actually, I need to lead people. I need to rule over people, and to do that, I need to be wise. I need to be able to judge them fairly. And so God recognizes that and says, well, I will give you that wisdom. I will give that wisdom to you. I will give you a heart that is wise and that understands. And that leads us to our bottom line a little bit, doesn't it? See, Solomon trusted God to give him wisdom because that's what he desired, that's what he wanted. He wanted to see wisdom and to have wisdom. And so he trusted God to give him that wisdom. Now we're going to see a little bit more of this story and how this plays out. See, Solomon eventually returned to Jerusalem, where he once again gave sacrifices to honour God. So he had gone to this city called Gibeon, and now he'd come home to Jerusalem, which is the capital of the empire, capital of the kingdom, which Solomon rules over. And so he again offers sacrifices to God, he honours God, and then he holds a really big feast. You can imagine maybe like a really, really, really big feast with all your friends and family coming together, a big long table with lots of food on it. Well, maybe something like that was what King Solomon was throwing. A huge feast to celebrate. During the feast, Solomon's new wisdom, right, he had asked for a wise and understanding heart. His new wisdom was going to be put to the test. Two women came in to settle an argument they were having. You see, each of these women had recently had a baby, but sadly one of these babies had died. Now, both of these women claimed that the living baby was theirs. The two of them came to Solomon to ask him to solve their problem, right? Solomon told his servants, "Bring me my sword." What? His sword? Why on earth would Solomon want his sword? That just seems crazy. Well, let's actually read from what it says in the Bible about this, because this might be a little bit crazy to understand. Solomon gave an order. He said, "Cut the living child in two. Give half to one woman and half to the other." Now, before I go any further, I just want you to know that Solomon never intended to actually hurt the baby. And it seems like that, but this was a way for Solomon to test who the real mother was and for him to solve the problem. He was never going to actually hurt the baby, but this was his way of proving and finding out who the real mother was. Alright, let's listen to what happened next. The woman whose son was alive was filled with deep love for her son. She said to the king, "My master, please give her the living baby." The other woman, "Don't kill him." But the other woman said, "Neither of us will have him. Cut him in two." Yikes! It became very clear, very quickly, who the real mother was. So Solomon ordered the baby be given to the real mother, to the first woman. See, news then of Solomon's wisdom spread far and wide throughout Israel and throughout the empire and the kingdom. All the people heard about Solomon's decision and trusted that he would judge them fairly. Right? That's what he wanted. He wanted to be able to judge people fairly, and people were starting to realize that, and they could see that. God made Solomon so wise that his understanding couldn't even be measured. Right? His understanding, all the things that he understood in his mind, his wisdom, was so great, it couldn't even be measured. That's how wise Solomon was. So from our story about the life of Solomon, we can see that Solomon was someone who trusted God to give him wisdom. He definitely, I think, thought that wisdom was worth searching for because he asked God for wisdom. He thought it was definitely something worthy to have, especially as a king. Not worthy like some money or a big fancy house or fame. Those things weren't worthy. No, wisdom was worthy for Solomon. But he also trusted God to give him wisdom, didn't he? He said, all right, God, I've got this really big job in front of me. I've got to lead this entire nation. I can only do that if I have wisdom. And so he trusted God to give him wisdom. And so for us, we can trust God in the same way. He can help us trust him, and he can give us wisdom when we ask for it. Because wisdom is finding out what we should do and doing it. If you remember that from last week, that's what wisdom is, finding out what we should do and doing it. And so when we search for wisdom, when we seek it out, but then we also trust God to give us wisdom, well, that's a really good thing. And we can do that, just like Solomon did. We can trust God to give us wisdom as well. Well, that's our story from 1 Kings. But our memory verse for this month, that comes from James chapter 1 verse 5, is actually really important and actually really links with Solomon's story. See, James 1 verse 5 says, if any of you needs wisdom, you should ask God for it. He will give it to you. God gives freely to everyone and doesn't find fault. Let me read that again. If any of you needs wisdom, you should ask God for it. He will give it to you. God gives freely to everyone and doesn't find fault. That's in James 1 verse 5. Well, how would I put that up there? James 1 verse 5. God will give us wisdom. When we ask for it, if we need wisdom, ask God for it. He will give it to us. That's a really good verse to remember. I mean, it's our memory verse after all. And so just like Solomon, we can ask God for wisdom. We can seek it out and we can search the Bible. We can search the words of God and say, oh, what's the things that I need to know? What are the things I need to learn? What are the things that I should be doing? And I can do them. So, the two things to remember from this week are, we want to trust God to give us wisdom, just like Solomon did. And we want to remember James 1 verse 5. If any of us need wisdom, we can ask God for it. He will give it to us. And he gives it freely to everyone and without finding fault. That's what we can remember. That's what we want to hold on to. Well, thanks for hanging out with me this week. It was really fun being able to share that story with you and sharing that really crazy story from Solomon and listening to this week's story. I'll see you guys next time. So until then, see you later. Bye guys.